The Chrysler Cirrus and Dodge Stratus, two mid-size sedans, and the Chrysler Sebring and Dodge Avenger, two sport coupes, are some of the latest entries into the Chrysler Corporation passenger car lineup. For 1995, the Cirrus and Stratus and the Sebring and Avenger each use a version of the MMC-built 2.5-liter V6 engine, which is based on the 3-liter MMC engine. In this program, we'll be providing you with service procedures for the 2.5-liter engine used in the Cirrus and Stratus. We'll cover the use of the special tools and provide you with some precautions. We'll show you general auto tensioner bolts and remove the tensioner. You can now remove the timing belt. When the belt is removed, it should be carefully inspected on both sides. Check for hardening, cracks, or missing teeth. Also check for abnormal wear on the sides of the belt. Now that the timing belt is removed, do not rotate the crankshaft, since the pistons will strike the valves. Remove both camshaft sprockets. Special tool number 6847 is used to hold the sprocket while the bolt is removed. The sprockets can then be removed from the shafts. On the top of the engine, start by removing the aluminum intake plenum. First, remove the EGR tube. Then remove the plenum support bracket bolts, located on the front and rear of the cylinder head. Remove the 7 bolts holding the plenum. And after making sure there are no hoses or wiring connectors attached, remove the plenum. At this point, cover the lower intake manifold ports to keep debris from falling into them. To remove the fuel rail, check that all electrical connectors have been removed from the fuel injectors. Connectors on the right bank of the engine will probably still be attached. Remove the 4 bolts holding the fuel rail to the lower intake manifold. Before you remove the fuel rail, be aware that there are spacers on the manifold at each of the fuel rail bolts. Lift the fuel rail off the engine, being careful not to let the spacers fall into the intake ports or the valley of the engine. This is especially important if the engine is in the car. To remove the lower intake manifold, remove the attaching nuts. As you remove the fasteners, you'll notice a spring washer under each of them. These washers compensate for expansion and contraction of the cylinder head to intake manifold mating surfaces and can be reused. Be careful, they could also find their way into the recesses of the engine. After removing the bolts and spring washers, remove the intake manifold and discard the gaskets. Inspect the plenum and lower intake manifold for cracks and distortion. Check the lower manifold to cylinder head gasket surfaces for flatness with a straight edge and feeler gauge. Specs are in the service manual. Next, you can remove the exhaust manifolds. You'll have to remove the oil dipstick guide tube to remove the left manifold. Start by removing the heat shields that are bolted onto each manifold. Then remove the stainless steel crossover pipe from the manifolds. Notice the flex tubing for expansion and contraction. The exhaust manifolds can then be removed. After cleaning the exhaust manifold gasket surfaces, inspect the manifolds for cracks or distortion. The 2-piece right side exhaust manifold shouldn't be disassembled unless the gasket shows signs of leaking. Check the cylinder head mounting surfaces for flatness with a straight edge and feeler gauge. Specs are provided in the service manual. Also check the crossover and other mounting surfaces for flatness. To remove the cylinder heads, start by removing the spark plug cables and remove the cylinder head covers. With the covers removed, you'll see the integrated oil separator inside. This would be a good time to inspect the spark plug tube seals located at the ends of each spark plug tube. If they show signs of hardness or cracking, they should be replaced. Now remove the distributor from the right head assembly. Remove the lower thermostat housing. And if you're disassembling the entire engine, remove the transfer tube. remove the cylinder head bolts and remove both cylinder heads. Now that the cylinder heads are removed, we'll get into valve train disassembly and inspection. But first, use your head to answer this review question. The lower intake manifold is held in place with bolts and A, lock washers, B, spring washers, or C, nylon washers. The answer is B. Spring washers are used to compensate for expansion and contraction of the cylinder head to intake manifold mating surfaces. Before cleaning and disassembling the cylinder head, check for leaks, cracks, and other damage that could indicate trouble. Clean the cylinder head and the oil passages. Then check the bottom of the cylinder heads for flatness with a straight edge and a feeler gauge. The most common place to find warpage is between the combustion chambers. If out of spec, the cylinder head surface can be ground. You should also check the cylinder block deck for flatness. Specs for flatness are provided in the service manual. To disassemble the cylinder head, begin by installing auto lash adjuster retainers on each rocker arm. These retainers hold the lash adjusters in position when the rocker arms are removed. Loosen the rocker arm shaft fasteners and remove the assemblies from the head. Before disassembling the rocker arm assembly, label the rocker arm shafts and arms. Then remove the bolts that hold the rocker arm shafts to the cylinder head. And remove the spring clips from the shaft. Slide the rocker arms off the shaft and keep them in order for reassembly. Inspect the rocker arms for scoring or damage. And check the rollers for wear. Also check the shafts where the rocker arms mount for wear or damage. Finally, probe the oil holes with a small wire to check for clogging and clean as required. This would also be a good time to check the auto lash adjuster function. To remove valves with the heads out of the vehicle, you can use a valve spring compressor and adapter, compress the valve spring, and remove the spring retainer locks. Release the spring compressor and remove the spring retainer and valve spring. The valve can now be removed. The valve seats are separate from the valve stem seals, which can be removed with pliers since they will not be reused. Inspect the valves for wear or damage. Check the valve stem tip for pitting or depressions, and look for wear along the valve stem. Check the valve margin with a steel rule. It should be 1 millimeter on intake valves and 1.2 millimeters on exhaust valves. Check the valve seat for even contact with the valve. To do this, put a light coating of Prussian blue on the valve seat. Set the valve in place and rotate the valve with light pressure. The blue should transfer to the entire width of the valve face for good contact with the valve seat. The stem to guide clearance should also be checked. A good way to do this is to measure the valve stem near the top and bottom with a micrometer, and measure the inside diameter of the valve guide with a hole gauge. Compare your two measurements with the specs in the service manual. If out of spec, the valve and guide should be replaced. Also check valve guide height with a dial caliper. It should be about 14 millimeters, or 551 thousandths of an inch. If the guide height is out of spec, a new guide will have to be pressed into the cylinder head. Finally, check the valve springs for free length. Also check the springs for squareness with a combination square by rotating it and checking for variations in height. Compare to the specs in the service manual and replace the spring if it is out of spec. The camshaft should also be inspected before the cylinder head is assembled. The right camshaft can be removed since the distributor was removed earlier. The thrust case must be removed from the left cylinder head in order to remove the left camshaft. With the camshafts removed, inspect the cylinder head journals for wear or damage and check the oil holes for blockage. Inspect camshaft bearing journals for scratches and worn areas. Light scratches can be removed with crocus cloth. If deep scratches are present, replace the camshaft. Check the lobes of the camshaft for pitting on the nose, flank, and base circle. Also check the lobes for wear. This can be done by comparing a measurement at the center of the lobe with one taken at the edge. If the lobes are worn or pitted, replace the camshaft, and be sure to check the corresponding rocker arm roller for wear or damage. Now that we've inspected the valve train and replaced all out-of-spec or damaged components, we can assemble the cylinder head. But first, answer this question on the valve train. What special tool is required to remove the rocker arm assembly? A. Valve spring compressor. B. Rocker arm holder. C. Lash adjuster retainer. Or D. Rocker shaft puller. The answer is C. Lash adjuster retainers must be installed to keep the lash adjusters from falling out of the rocker arms. Begin your cylinder head assembly by lubricating the camshaft journals. Carefully install the camshafts into the cylinder head. Install the thrust case on the rear of the left cylinder head and torque the fasteners to 85 inch-pounds. Now install the new camshaft seals. The left camshaft seal is installed using special tool number 6863. The right camshaft seal is installed using special tool MD 998713. Before installing the valves, coat the valve stems with clean engine oil. Insert a valve into the cylinder head and support it from the bottom. Intake and exhaust valves get different valve seals. Intake valve seals are silver, exhaust valve seals are black. Install the valve seal on the valve guides using the special valve seal installer. Install the valve spring seats, valve springs, and retainers. Make sure the enameled end of the spring faces the rocker arm. Compress the valve springs only enough to install the locks. Install both halves of the lock on each valve. Then slowly release the spring compressor, making sure that both locks remain in the correct location when the tool is removed. Begin the rocker arm assembly by making sure the lash adjusters are partially full of oil. You'll know there is oil in them if there is little or no plunger travel as the lash adjuster is depressed. When each lash adjuster is installed, install the lash adjuster retainer. Now lubricate the rocker arms and install them onto the shafts in their correct positions. Also install the retaining bolts and put the spring clips in their correct positions on the exhaust and intake shafts. Install the rocker arm shaft assemblies with the flats in the rocker arm shafts facing toward the timing belt side of the engine for the right cylinder head. For the left cylinder head, install each assembly with the flat toward the transmission side of the engine. Tighten the rocker arm retaining bolts to 200 inch-pounds in the correct sequence. This information is provided in the service manual. Finally, remove the lash adjuster retainers from the rocker arms. Now that the cylinder head is assembled, we'll move on to the lower engine. But first, assemble your thoughts for this review question. Which color valve seal is installed on the intake valve guide? A. Silver, B. Black, or C. Brown? The answer is A. The silver valve seal is installed on the intake valve guide. To begin disassembly of the lower engine, start by removing the oil pan. Also remove the oil pickup tube. Next, label the piston and rod assembly at the connecting rod and cap with the cylinder number. Remove the connecting rod caps and carefully remove the pistons and connecting rods from the cylinders. As you remove the caps and pistons, inspect the connecting rod bearings for unusual scoring or damage. Connecting rods are replaced with pistons as an assembly. To remove the crankshaft, begin by removing the crankshaft-driven oil pump at the front of the engine. Notice that the oil pump case retains the front crankshaft oil seal. Next, remove the rear oil seal retainer and seal as an assembly. Release the monoblock main bearing cap bolts gradually and evenly across the cap. And remove the main bearing cap assembly. The crankshaft can now be lifted out of the block. Inspect the lower main bearings for signs of scoring or other damage as you remove them. You should also remove the lower thrust bearings and inspect them. Next, identify and inspect the upper thrust bearings and main bearings as you remove them to identify problem areas. With the lower end of the engine disassembled, you can inspect and measure lower end components. We'll begin with the cylinders and pistons. Using a shop light, closely inspect the surface of each cylinder wall for vertical scratches, scoring, or cracks. If not badly scored or scratched, the cylinder should be measured for taper and out of round. After cleaning and deglazing the cylinders, use a dial bore gauge to make checks perpendicular and parallel with the crank bore center line. The top checks should be made about ½ an inch below the deck. The middle checks should be made about halfway down. And the bottom checks should be made about ½ an inch up from the bottom. Specifications are provided in the service manual for maximum taper and out of round. Also measure the cylinder bores. Standard bore dimensions are provided. If the bores are damaged or out of spec, the cylinders will have to be machined or the block replaced. The pistons should also be inspected and measured. Look for cracked skirts, worn ring grooves, cracked ring lands, or other damage. If the pistons look okay, they should be measured for wear. Measure across the piston at 12 millimeters above the bottom of the piston skirt on the thrust face. Compare these measurements with the cylinder bore measurements. Average piston to cylinder clearance is about 25 thousandths of a millimeter. If the piston to cylinder clearance is excessive, you must either obtain the correct size standard piston or machine the cylinders and use oversized pistons. And remember, pistons and connecting rods are replaced as an assembly. Next, we'll inspect the crankshaft and connecting rod bearings and journals. Visually check the crankshaft main and connecting rod bearing journals for wear, scuffs, or scoring. Very fine crocus cloth may be used to clean up minor burrs or marks. If the damage is serious, the crankshaft must be replaced. If the journals pass a visual inspection, their outside diameters should be measured in order to select the proper bearing size. You should also check the journals for taper and out of round. Taper is checked by measuring each journal outside diameter at both ends. Out of round is checked by measuring the journal from side to side and comparing it to a measurement from top to bottom. Each crankshaft main bearing journal measurement is used along with the clearance measurement to select the proper bearing for that journal. Bearing sizes will be different from journal to journal. The different bearing sizes can be identified by color markings on their edge. Also remember to order a set of new thrust bearings when you order the main and rod bearings. When the proper bearings are selected, crankshaft main bearing oil clearance should be checked with plastic gauge before the lower end is assembled. You'll also have to use plastic gauge when reinstalling the connecting rod bearings. Install the upper main bearings, making sure the oil holes are in alignment and the bearing tabs seat in the block. All upper bearings have oil grooves. Install the crankshaft in the block. Install the lower main bearings without the oil grooves in the monoblock cap. Cut 4 pieces of plastic gauge to the width of the main bearings and place them on the crankshaft journals. Install the bearing cap and bolts. Clearance should be measured with the block upside down, so the weight of the crankshaft is on the block, away from the plastic gauge. Don't rotate the crankshaft or the plastic gauge will be smeared. Torque the bolts to 40 foot-pounds. Carefully remove the bearing cap and measure the width of the plastic gauge at the widest part, using the scale on the plastic gauge package. Refer to the service manual for proper clearances. Crankshaft connecting rod journal measurements should also be made and compared to specs. If within specs, install the rod bearings in the rod caps and rod ends. Make sure the bearing position notches are on the same side and aligned correctly. Now check the connecting rods for rod bearing clearance. Rod bearing clearance is also measured with plastic gauge. Rotate the crankshaft until the connecting rod journal to be checked starts on the way up from the bottom of its stroke. Install the piston and connecting rod. Place the plastic gauge across the bearing cap, about 1/4 inch away from the oil hole. Install the bearing cap, making sure alignment marks made during disassembly are lined up on the rod and cap. Install the fasteners and torque to 40 foot-pounds. To check connecting rod bearing clearance, remove the bearing cap and measure the plastic gauge. Compare the measurement with the specs in the service manual. Oh, and one more thing. Be sure to clean the plastic gauge off the bearing surfaces after your clearance checks are completed. Another check of the connecting rod is side clearance, the distance between the rod and the crankshaft. This clearance is measured with a feeler gauge. If not within specs, crankshaft journal or connecting rod width is incorrect. When the measurements of the lower engine are all within spec, you can begin engine assembly. But first, let's measure your knowledge with a review question. Crankshaft main bearing clearance is measured with A, a dial caliper, B, plastic gauge, or C, an outside micrometer. The answer is B. Crankshaft main bearing clearance is measured with plastic gauge. With the main bearings installed, you only need to install the upper thrust bearings before installing the crankshaft. Apply a thin film of grease to the plain side of the thrust bearings and position them on each side of the number 3 main bearing with the plain side toward the block. The upper front thrust bearing does not have a tab. The upper rear thrust bearing does have a tab. Oil the bearings and journals and install the crankshaft. Install the other pair of thrust bearings in the cap at the number 3 bearing. The lower front thrust bearing has a tab. Carefully install the bearing cap assembly with the arrow on the cap toward the front of the engine. Oil the bearing cap bolt threads and install the bolts. Torque progressively in the correct sequence to 60 foot-pounds. At this point, crankshaft end play should be checked. To do this, mount a dial indicator to the front of the engine, locating the probe on the nose of the crankshaft. Move the crankshaft all the way to the rear of its travel. Zero the dial indicator. Move the crankshaft all the way to the front and read the dial indicator. Your measurement should be within the specs in the service manual. If the end play is within specs, you can continue with engine assembly. If not, check for crankshaft wear. Install the rear crankshaft oil seal in the housing with a special rear seal installer. Then apply a 3mm bead of Mopar silicone adhesive to the oil seal housing, circling all the mounting holes. For corner sealing, apply a 3 to 6mm drop at each corner. Apply a light coating of engine oil to the entire circumference of the oil seal lip and install the seal assembly on the cylinder block. Tighten the bolts to 104 inch-pounds. Before installing the front oil seal, you must install the oil pump housing. Apply Mopar gasket maker to the oil pump housing and install the oil pump. Now install and tighten the oil pump bolts. A diagram of bolt sizes, locations, and torque specs are provided in the service manual. Using front crankshaft oil seal installer and guide, install the oil seal in the oil pump. We're now ready to install the pistons and connecting rods. Before installation, be sure the piston rings are measured and installed properly using the procedures in the service manual. Install connecting rod bolt protectors on the rod bolts. To install the pistons, immerse the piston head and rings in clean engine oil. Slide the ring compressor over the piston and tighten. Rotate the crankshaft so that the connecting rod journal is centered in the cylinder bore at the bottom of its stroke. Coat the cylinder bores with engine oil and install the piston into the cylinder with the directional arrow on top of the piston facing the front of the engine. Tap the piston down the cylinder bore using a wooden hammer handle. At the same time, guide the connecting rod into position on the crankshaft journal. Install the rod caps with the bearings installed, and install the nuts on cleaned and oiled rod bolts, and torque to 40 foot-pounds. With the bottom end of the engine assembled, you can install the oil pickup tube and the oil pan. When installing the oil pan, make sure both surfaces are clean and apply a 4mm diameter bead of silicone sealant to the oil pan, going around the inside of all mounting holes. Install the pan and tighten the screws to 50 inch-pounds. Before installing the cylinder heads, back the crankshaft sprocket 3 teeth below top dead center to prevent piston contact with the valves. Make sure the head and block surfaces are clean and install the head gasket over the locating dowels, making sure that no oil or coolant passages are blocked. Install the head on the locating dowels. Install the 10mm Allen head bolts with washers and tighten the bolts in the proper tightening sequence. Tighten the bolts gradually, working in 2 or 3 steps, and finally torque to 80 foot-pounds. Install the transfer tube and the lower thermostat housing. Be sure to use new gaskets and O-rings on cooling system components. Install the distributor and install the platinum spark plugs. Platinum spark plugs have platinum pads welded to both electrodes. The pads can be scraped off, so they should not be cleaned. In addition, the gap should only be checked using a taper gauge. Before installing the cylinder head covers, be sure the mating surfaces are clean. Apply the gasket into the groove in the cylinder head cover. Install the cylinder head covers and torque the fasteners to 88 inch-pounds. To install the exhaust manifolds, be sure the gasket surfaces are clean and install new exhaust manifold gaskets. Do not apply sealer to these surfaces. Now put the manifold in place and tighten the fasteners, starting at the center and progressing outward in both directions. Torque the bolts to 200 inch-pounds. Install the crossover tube with new gaskets and tighten its fasteners to 51 foot-pounds. Finally, install the exhaust manifold heat shields and tighten the attaching screws. Also install the oil dipstick guide tube. Install new lower intake manifold gaskets and install the lower intake manifold. Install the spring washers and nuts and torque in sequence to 250 inch-pounds. Apply a light coating of engine oil to the O-ring on the nozzle end of each injector. Install the fuel rail spacers. Install the fuel rail, making sure each injector nozzle is properly seated into its opening in the intake manifold. Torque the fuel rail bolts to 8 foot-pounds. Attach the electrical connectors to the fuel injectors if applicable. Install a new upper intake plenum gasket. And install the plenum. Install the plenum bolts, but do not tighten them. Also install the bolts for the plenum support bracket. Tighten the plenum and support bracket bolts to 13 foot-pounds. Install the camshaft sprockets using the same tools you used to remove them. Torque the bolts to 70 foot-pounds. To install the timing belt, begin by slowly compressing the tensioner plunger in a vise. When the plunger is compressed into the tensioner body, install a pin through the hole in the body and plunger to keep the plunger compressed until the tensioner is installed. Install the tensioner on the engine without tightening the tensioner bolts. If you haven't done so, set the crankshaft sprocket to top dead center. Then back it counterclockwise 3 teeth before top dead center. Align the cam sprockets with the timing marks on the rocker covers. Install the timing belt on the right camshaft sprocket first and install a binder clip on the belt and sprocket to hold the belt in position. Keeping the belt tight, install it under the water pump pulley and then around the left camshaft sprocket. Install another binder clip to hold the belt in place. Now rotate the crankshaft to top dead center. Continue routing the belt by the idler pulley and around the crankshaft sprocket to the tensioner pulley. When the belt is installed, remove the binder clips. With the crankshaft bolt and a spacer installed in the crankshaft sprocket, rotate the crankshaft clockwise to remove any slack in the belt. Using the timing belt tensioner wrench and a dial-type torque wrench on the tensioner pulley, apply 40 inch-pounds of torque to the tensioner in a counterclockwise direction. Be careful, applying more than 40 inch-pounds could break the tool. While tension is on the pulley, tighten the tensioner pulley bolt to 35 foot-pounds. With torque being applied to the tensioner pulley, push the auto tensioner against the tensioner pulley bracket and tighten the auto tensioner fasteners to 275 inch-pounds. Now pull the tensioner retaining pin from the tensioner. Rotate the crankshaft 2 revolutions in a clockwise direction and check the alignment of the timing marks. Wait a few minutes, then install the pin into the tensioner. The pin should slide in and out. When the belt is installed and tensioned properly, you can install the timing belt covers. Install the front engine mount bracket, the lower timing belt cover, the upper right cover, and the upper left cover. Then the power steering pump bracket. Finally, install the crankshaft damper and crankshaft damper bolt. Tighten the bolt to 134 foot-pounds. The engine is now ready to be installed in the vehicle, and I know you're ready to answer another review question. How do you determine if the timing belt is properly tensioned? A. The tensioner retaining pin slides in and out of the timing belt tensioner. B. Play in the timing belt is less than ½ an inch. Or C. Tensioner piston protrusion is between 7.6 and 9 millimeters. The answer is A. The timing belt is properly tensioned when the tensioner pin slides in and out of the timing belt tensioner. A complete list of special tools for the 2.5-liter engine is provided in the service manual. Well, we've given you a good look at the 2.5-liter engine while providing you with its service procedures. For more training on engine repair, enroll in one of the courses at a Chrysler Technical Training Center near you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next month.